Each economy, whether you are the Alberta economy, the Canadian economy, the Chinese economy, has to set priorities. There are 7 goals that economies have when it comes to macroeconomics. But the challenge is you can't have them all at once. Some of them conflict. When you try to achieve one, it reduces your ability to achieve another. So we're going to look at these 7 different goals. And as we look at these, we're going to look at how do we define it. We're going to look at where do we currently stand compared to other places. Okay, and what are some of the challenges in achieving it? And as we do this, think about if you are in charge of the economy, which one would you prioritize? Which one is the most important? All right, so let's look at them. There are 7 goals: improve standard of living, economic growth, full employment or low unemployment, stable prices, having a balance of international trade, so we're looking at exports and imports, an equitable distribution of income, so we're looking at the income of the rich and the poor, and manageable government debt and deficits. So let's take them one at a time. Let's start with the first one. So the first goal we're looking at is improve standard of living. This is the degree to which people have access to the goods and services that make their life better, safer, happier, healthier. So when you have an improved standard of living, you likely have better healthcare, more education, a cleaner environment, access to more entertainment and culture. So we need to look at how do we measure this? How do we measure your access to the goods and services that make your life better? Well, the most common measurement for improved standard of living is what is called gross national income per capita. Let me just move my face here. So if we're looking at people's access to goods and services, one way to measure it is how much income do they have to buy those things, to buy that access. So we need to break down this gross national income per capita. So the per capita part, okay, this is per person. So looking at our population, okay, per person. And then we have national income. So national income is all the ways that we can make money. So one way to make money is to work, your labor. And so we can measure national income as wages. The other ways to make money in our economy are to sell your other factors of production. So what were the factors of production? Land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So how do we pay for those? Well, how do we pay for land? Well, the economic term was rent. How do we pay for labor? That was the wages. How do we pay for capital? That's interest. And how do we reward our entrepreneurs? That is profit. So the ways that you make your money in our society are by selling your land, labor, capital, or by being an entrepreneur. So our national income, we can find it by adding wages, interest, rent, and profits. And we'll use the sign pi for profits. And that's because we use the P for price. Okay, so wages, interest, rent, and profits make up national income. But when we measure standard of living, we don't just look at national income, we look at gross national income. So the gross part is Canadians, regardless of where they live. So, for example, I'm an American living and working in Canada. So yes, I make wages. But when we look at gross national income, we are looking at the income of Canadians. So I'm not included in GNI per capita. If you're Canadian and you're living in France and working, maybe you're making wages, maybe you're an entrepreneur, okay? Because you are a Canadian, even though you are living abroad, you are part of GNI per capita. So why would we use GNI per capita as a measure of standard of living? Well, we need to look at the fact that people move around. They might live abroad and send money back home. Okay, so you might live and work here in Canada and then send money to relatives and family abroad. We also have a number of countries that import in or bring in foreign workers. Okay. So we need to look at what is it that Canadians have access to when we're measuring our standard of living, and recognizing that their standard of living and their ability to have access to goods and services may actually be based on accessing wages or other income from work they're doing abroad in another country. So we look at GNI per capita to measure the standard of living. So we'll look in a moment about where we stand when it comes to this, but how do you improve your standard of living? Well, if we can increase that gross national income per capita, so we have more wages, interest, rent, and profits per person, then we should be able to buy or gain access to more goods and services. Now, the challenge with using this measurement is that it doesn't guarantee that everyone's better off. Because we're doing it per capita, we're essentially dividing by the number of people in our calculation. So it's quite possible that some people's income is going up and others' income is going down. This looks at the average. So it doesn't guarantee that everyone is better off just because your GNI per capita goes up. That is the average or typical person, but that could mean that others have less access to goods and services before, which is why we look at that, if we go back to our equitable distribution of income. So just because you're improving your standard of living doesn't mean you're improving that equitable distribution of income. You may have the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, so that creates more of a divide, a less equitable distribution. The other thing the GNI per capita doesn't take into account is that one way we could all make more income is that we could do activities that have a great impact on the environment. Okay, we might see a change in the crime rate. It doesn't really take these things into account. We could also be all working 24/7, 5 jobs to improve our income per capita, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have time to enjoy it. We may have more stress. So this is one way to measure an improved standard of living, but income per capita itself is not standard of living. It's just a way to approximate your access to goods and services that make your life better. All right, so where do we stand? What is our GNI per capita? Well, there's different ways that you can measure GNI per capita. Okay, so we can look at it in nominal terms, or we can look at it in real terms. So you see the word real here. The idea with real is that we take out inflation. This allows us to compare one year's income to a previous year's income, recognizing the fact that even though your income goes up, if the cost of living goes up because everything is more expensive, so higher prices or inflation, then we're not really better off. So if we take out inflation, we can compare basically our buying power of our income in one year to our buying power of our income in a different year, so that we can see if we're really gaining more access to goods and services. So let's take a look. In 2019, GNI per capita for Canada. So how much do you think that the typical Canadian makes in terms of income? Well, in 2019, it was $53,482. Okay. If we take out inflation, and we're going to look later this semester at how you remove the inflation, how do you go from this, which is nominal, to real? So we'll look at how we do that a little bit later this semester. But if we take out inflation, then that 53,482 is 38,981. So we can see that over time, our real income as Canadians has gone up. Right in the 2000s, it was about 37,890. Now we're at 38,900. So over time, it looks like we are gaining more access to goods and services. Well, this is Canada at 53,482 in nominal terms. What do you think the GNI per capita is for Alberta? What does the typical individual in Alberta make in terms of income? Is it higher or lower? Well, in 2019, that number was 60,564. So the income per capita is higher in Alberta than it is for the average Canadian. Now let's do some comparisons to other countries. If we're going to compare to other countries, then we have to be in a common currency. So we could look at it in US dollars, or we could look at it in what's called international dollars. Used to be when you did comparisons between countries, it was always in US dollars. That was the predominant measure. And that was because US was really the dominant economy across the world. As other economies across the world become more dominant, we have switched to something called international dollars, which is essentially a weighted average. It's a bundle of different currencies. So when you look at that same 2019 GNI per capita, which was 53,482 in Canadian dollars in nominal terms in 2019, if we convert that into international dollars, you can see it's 50,810. And how does that compare to other countries? Well, some of the highest GNI per capita in the world are countries like Qatar and Singapore, Switzerland. And you can see that the GNI per capita is $65,880 in the United States compared to the $50,810 in Canada. Now, GNI per capita is not the only way to measure the standard of living. Okay. We can measure that improvement in the standard of living with three other ways. Okay, remember, standard of living is defined as access to the goods and services that make your life better. One way to approximate that was income, GNI per capita, but there are other ways to measure that as well. We can look at education. So the more educated the population, the more schooling, then the greater access they have to healthcare, right? Because we're likely to have doctors, and greater access to entertainment, culture, and those things that make life better. Here you see on the right, these are the results of the PISA test. PISA, P-I-S-A, is the Program for International Student Assessment. So there's actually an exam that is used across all countries to compare the knowledge of students. And if you lived in Red Deer in 2009, then Red Deer was part of the Canadian sample for that year. So you would have taken the PISA test. What we have here is the 2006 and the 2012 results. And so we can see Canada here in green. And what you see is that between 2006 and 2012, we decreased in ranking in math and in reading. Okay, so our students are less educated than other countries. There are other ways to compare the standard of living. So in addition to education and GNI per capita, we can also look at the poverty rate and the Human Development Index. So the poverty rate would look at the percentage of people who have income below a certain level that's considered necessary for basic necessities. And so that dollar value that sets that poverty line is a bit different in each country based on the cost of living. The third measure is the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index combines life expectancy, education, and GDP per capita. The idea being that we look at the amount of goods being produced in the country per person, as well as measuring, right, our access to healthcare by looking at our life expectancy, and then looking at education combined. So we'll look at HDI in just a second, but before we do that, let's not leave the education one quite yet. So the question is what if your country spends more money on education? Does that increase your education level and thereby increase the standard of living, the access to goods and services in their society? Well, what you see here on the left is public spending or government spending on education. So you can see what countries spend the most on education. And the question is, does that have an impact on how well your students perform? And so you'll notice that the education ranking on the left doesn't seem to be impacted by the amount of spending. Some countries that spend a lot on education, some spend less, are still in that top 5. On the right, you can see how much is paid to instructors, to teachers. And again, on the left, you have their ranking. On the right, you have their salary. And here we have an adjustment, right? So we can compare between countries that PPP is purchasing power parity. And we'll talk about that when we talk about exchange rates later this semester. All right, so we said to measure standard of living, access to goods and services that make your life better, we can measure it with GNI per capita. We can measure education. Okay. We could measure the poverty rate. Or we can measure the Human Development Index. And the Human Development Index, a combination of income per person, the life expectancy, and education. So here we have Canada, and here we have the US. And when you compare the two, you'll notice that Canadian life expectancy is a bit higher than the United States. And over the last couple years, this is a couple years old, that gap has even increased even more. So how come the US is higher on the Human Development Index than Canada if Canada has a higher life expectancy, if we live longer? And it comes down to that income per person, looking at, excuse me, that gross national income. So income gives you access to goods and services. Life expectancy measures really your access to healthcare. And so we're trying to combine these to see overall your access to goods and services that make your life better. Here we can see with the Human Development Index, countries that have seen the greatest change in their HDI, and that would be countries like Nepal and China and India. And then you can see countries that have seen a decline in their Human Development Index, and these are often ones that are experience some kind of war or disruption within their society, which is reducing access to goods and services.